Hi, I'm Janie Helms, and I will be doing a presentation on a bacteria disease in the upper respiratory system. I am going to focus on scarlet fever. The objectives of this presentation is to identify the scientific name and the organism that causes the scarlet fever. I will discuss its taxonomy, the structure of it, what path it takes for you to get this infection, as well as how it spreads, where it comes from, how to treat it, and if you can prevent it. Its name has had kind of a long history of how you got scarlet fever, especially to distinguish it from other sicknesses. But by definition, scarlet fever is an acute infection from a bacteria that's specifically group A, called Streptococcus Pyogenus. Now, depending on who you are, when you get it, how severe it is, and how long you get it can vary. But when you do, you are going to get a rash over your entire body. It does look different than a rash that you would get with the measles or the chickenpox. You will have a fever. And something that's different than other sicknesses, your tongue can develop a strawberry-like appearance and eventually swell and enlarge due to this infection. Now, the history behind it getting its name and us discovering that it was caused from that bacteria, it has been known, the streptococcal bacteria has been known since the 16th century. In 1553, a Sicilian noticed that the rash that they were seeing was different than the measles. In 1565, someone from the Netherlands decided that they noticed that there was a sore throat during their epidemic that didn't necessarily match the sickness they were having or what they were used to. In 1578, Jean Cotier from France gave the first definitive description of what they were seeing. He called it a general weariness, headache, redness of eyes, sore throat, and a fever. Then we get into the next century. In 1628, we had Daniel Sinnert, who started to piece together and notice people who had this sickness, some latent health problems that arise. Some people, he was noticing they started to have arthritis issues. They also had some swelling and heart failure problems. In 1675, it finally got into medical literature, and it was noted that this was a separate sickness. This is very specifically, from this bacteria in its own terms, scarlet fever. But then it wasn't until 1920, or in the 1920s, that George and Gladys Dick discovered that that bacteria that caused the scarlet fever was specifically from a toxin that is produced from strep throat. And strep throat is the first infection that comes from this bacteria. So they called it the Dick toxin, and we discovered that it was that specific toxin that led to the rash, fever, and the tongue swelling. So once we knew even more specifics about it, we really started to get down to its taxonomy. We know that it is a bacteria. Here I have laid out every specific kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, all the way down to the bacteria that we know it is, the Streptococcus Pyogenus. There is a picture here of what it would look like under a microscope. Its specific structure, here is another image of it. You can see that there are kind of right here, they're attached. You see them entwined or at least laid next to each other. So they usually occur in pairs or chains. They are considered a gram-positive bacteria. They are non-motile. They don't form spores. They also have a hyaluronic acid capsule. And what that does is it inhibits phagocytosis, which is the body's way of building that kind of cellular immunity. So phagocytosis gives us the path that the bacteria eventually takes to actually cause the scarlet fever, you have that first bullet point here. I am describing how this is the original bacteria strain, and it's going to cause basically strep throat. And then that strep throat produces a toxin that is released into your bloodstream. Then it goes through lysogenicized, they call it lysogenicized by the bacteriophage, which means that that genetic information of that bacteria virus, it's going to actually incorporate it into the bacteria's chromosomes, so its characteristics are altered. So once that happens, it creates this hyaluronic acid capsule, which stops phagocytosis from happening. It's going to resist it. And again, what phagocytosis is, it helps with your cellular immunity. It is the process that recognizes these pathogens. It sends a signal to activate your body's internal memory so it knows how to fight it. And what happens is it ends up ingesting these larger particles from these pathogens and even some other cells that end up being dead. It's the way of getting your body cleansed or clean of these pathogens to help fight it. But this hyaluronic acid capsule helps that not happen. So how does this spread and where can we find it? Well, for the most part, children between the ages of 5 and 15 are going to be the ones who are the most prevalent. They're the most, they're at most risk and are, by numbers, the ones that get it. Me personally, I did have scarlet fever. I got scarlet fever, also called scarlatina. I got it when I was 10. And I was gone from school from about 10 days, about 2 weeks worth of school I missed. I had a more severe case. So you get this sickness, you get this bacteria by respiratory secretions. So saliva, germs, that's direct contact through touching and spreading those bodily fluids. Now, there hasn't been a lot of experiments. There has been a lot of case studies. And the most recent ones that I picked out, there was one in 2009 in the UK, and then again in 2018, they were seeing an epidemic all the way across China. So they put together a study to try and narrow down where and how it was happening so that they could try to control it. So I'm going to first talk about the case study in the UK. What happened was in 2009 of a primary school that had ranged from preschoolers all the way up to 6th graders. They had 126 students, so not a large primary school, but of those 126 students, 57 of them, which was 45%, in a 1 month's time, 45% of them came down with scarlet fever. What they did discover was that it was being transmitted through direct contact, and this happened right after they had an outbreak of strep throat. So these kids, strep throat was going around school, and then all of a sudden now everyone is getting scarlet fever. They did notice that the most transmissions, or at least the biggest numbers, were all between siblings, which if you think about it makes sense because those siblings are probably not going to be as hygienic or healthy around each other than they would other children. In this case study, kids missed a range from 1 to 10 days. The average was only 3. None of the children were hospitalized. And of those 57 students, 65% of them received treatment. So 20 of the 50, 20 of those, they only got 5 days worth of treatment, and then 17 got 10 days worth of treatment. And if you look at the graph that I have here, it shows that you have the month of March, and right there in the middle of March, we had a couple cases that were here. We had 4 cases kind of spread out through year 5, year 4, a couple in year 2. But then right here in the middle of the month, cases started to skyrocket. And you can see that they were pretty spread out between the grades. So we had a little break here, more came, and by the time April got here, after this April 2nd, it died down and the spread of the infection had passed. So you can kind of see how right here this was the height of the epidemic, but they were able to get the kids cleared up with antibiotics or staying away from school and healing. The case study in China, they were having an outbreak across their whole country. So their scientists went into this case study with an objective to figure out what are the characteristics of this are they seeing, where are they seeing them, and can they find some kind of scientific basis on when they tell their people how to prevent and control it from spreading. Throughout this study, they reported 2,314 cases, and what they discovered was that males, not by a large margin, but there was a higher case of males in comparison to females. Also, urban areas had the largest percentage of those that got sick. So cities with the bigger the population, they were getting the worst outbreaks. Similar to what I said before with the age group of kids getting this, 96.89% of these children were between the ages of 3 and 11. And then if you look at the graph, you see that there were 2 peaks. You always hear kind of that there's a lot of sicknesses in the winter, but what they noticed was they had 2 peaks throughout the year. They got a peak smack dab in the middle of summer in June, and then another peak, which was lower than summer, but another peak that happened right in the middle of winter. So what they came up with was that especially in those urban areas, they had to use kind of a joint task force. They had to come together. They had to realize that they needed to control the spread of the infection. They said that hygiene, health procedures needed to be followed, such as hand washing, not sharing drinks, pretty much the normal disease or infection spread prevention strategies that we still use today. But they were emphasizing them strongly, especially in the urban areas, because of the numbers that they discovered during this case study. So again, on prevention, there is nothing fancy. There is no extremes that you need to take. Just keeping basic healthy habits like washing hands, not sharing drinks, good hygiene. It's going to help that infection not develop. There are no vaccines available to keep from getting it. So hygiene really is the only path. If you get it, there are Many treatment options in severe cases, like mine when I got scarlet fever, was penicillin. I had to get a penicillin shot, which kind of hijacked or accelerated my healing process, and then I had to take medicine, the pills, 4 times a day for 10 days. Now, a lot of people are allergic to penicillin, so there are 2 different medicines that you can take, and one you can take 4 times a day, the other one only twice a day. Now, if you have a less severe case, you may not need penicillin. You would be able to take other kinds of problems or medicines, drugs such as aspirin, ibuprofen, anything that would relieve the symptoms such as the fever or swelling. Taking that inflammation down helps your body be able to fight it better. So, an overview. Scarlet fever in itself is not an organism, but it is the result of one. It's an infection that comes from contracting that bacteria. Depending on who you are and your health, how bad it is and how long you keep it can vary. The main symptoms are a rash that is separate from measles, a sore throat, and a fever. And another distinguishing fact that I didn't have on there was that tongue. There's no vaccines, but we can treat it very easily. If you don't decide to treat it, you can develop problems in the future, such as they think that the arthritis or maybe even some heart problems or swelling of the heart could be in effect. And then here are all of my references. Thank you for listening to my presentation on scarlet fever.